My name is Emily Parker. I'm 25 years old, and for the past 3 years I have given every ounce of myself to one dream: building a clinic from the ground up. It wasn't glamorous, not in the beginning. I remember nights spent on a folding chair in an office that barely had working lights, eating cheap takeout while balancing bills on my lap. The walls were bare, the equipment outdated, and the bank account so fragile that I woke up sweating at 2 a.m, wondering if it would all collapse before it even began. But I kept going, because I believed that if I worked hard enough, if I sacrificed enough, someday it would flourish. And it did. Today my clinic is thriving, with patients who trust me, staff who respect me, and a future I earned with my own blood and determination. That's why the invitation to dinner felt different. My parents rarely asked to meet me anywhere unless they wanted something. But a small part of me, the hopeful daughter that still lingered under the surface, wondered if this time was different. Maybe they had finally seen what I had accomplished. Maybe they wanted to acknowledge me not as their little girl, but as the professional I had become. Sitting across from them at their favorite steakhouse, the hum of conversations blending with the clinking of silverware, I allowed myself to hope that they were proud of me. The evening began ordinarily enough. My mother ordered her usual glass of Chardonnay. My father launched into a casual story about a neighbor's new car, and Rachel, my sister, arrived late. As always, her phone glued to her hand. I tried to brush it off, telling myself not to expect too much. But then, halfway through the appetizers, my father reached beneath the table and slid a heavy envelope across the crisp white tablecloth. He did it with the ease of a man presenting a formality, as though the contents were inevitable, as though my role was merely to sign where indicated. I opened it cautiously. Inside, neat pages of legal documents stared back at me, cold, impersonal, bearing the sharp scent of ink and authority. My mother leaned in with a practiced smile, her voice tinged with the rehearsed tone she used when she thought she was delivering good news. "Your sister Rachel will be joining as co-manager," my father announced, his tone flat, casual, as if announcing the weather. He tapped the papers with his index finger. "She'll be entitled to 25% of the profits, effective immediately." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. My chest tightened, my breath caught, and for a moment, the clamor of the restaurant disappeared into a sharp, ringing silence. My fork slipped against the plate, the sound oddly loud in the pause that followed. 25%, a quarter of everything I had built, handed to Rachel as though it were a birthday gift. I looked at them, searching for the punchline. Surely this had to be a mistake. Surely they couldn't expect me to simply hand over years of my work, my sacrifices, my sleepless nights. But their faces told me otherwise. My father's expression was unreadable, his jaw set in a way that warned me not to argue. My mother's smile didn't falter, though her eyes flickered with something sharp, almost daring me to object. Rachel, predictably, didn't even glance at me. She was scrolling on her phone, her lips curved in the faintest smirk, as though she already knew the outcome. Heat rushed to my cheeks. I felt both invisible and cornered, like the walls of the restaurant had closed in around me. They hadn't asked me. They hadn't even warned me. They had decided, together, that my sister, who had never once stayed up with me at the clinic until midnight, who had never worried about rent or equipment, who had never even shown interest beyond sneering at the smell of antiseptic, would be rewarded with a quarter of my life's work. My mind flickered with memories. Rachel complaining about how hard her day was because her manicure had chipped. Rachel borrowing money she never repaid. Rachel calling me obsessive when I worked weekends instead of joining her at parties. And now this. She wasn't expected to build, to sacrifice, or to prove herself. She was simply being handed what I had pulled for. The sting wasn't just in the injustice, it was in the familiarity of it. This was the pattern of my childhood replayed in sharper, crueler tones. Rachel had always been the golden child, the one showered with gifts and second chances, while I was told to be patient, to wait, to understand. I thought adulthood would change that. I thought building something of my own would finally shift their perspective. But here I was, 25 years old, with a thriving clinic and staff who depended on me. And still they looked at me as someone whose efforts existed to serve Rachel. I wanted to speak, but the words stuck in my throat. My body buzzed with shock, my fingers trembling over the papers that sought to strip me of everything I had built. I watched my father lean back, confident, already convinced of his authority. My mother adjusted her wine glass, sipping delicately, as though the matter was settled. And Rachel, my sister, finally looked up, her smile widening just enough to reveal satisfaction. The betrayal was sharp, precise, and it cut deeper than any argument we had ever had. They weren't simply asking me to share. They were declaring that my work, my future, was theirs to distribute. In that moment, I realized this dinner wasn't about pride or recognition. It was a theft wrapped in family expectation, presented under the guise of fairness. And as the silence thickened, I sat frozen, the envelope heavy in my lap, my mind reeling with the undeniable truth. The people who should have celebrated my success had come to take it from me instead. I stared at them across the table, my chest burning so hot, it felt like my ribs might crack open. The polished silverware, the low hum of conversations around us, the clinking of wine glasses, all of it blurred into background noise. My father's hand still rested on the envelope, as if to remind me it wasn't going anywhere. My mother's faint smile remained fixed, brittle, and expectant. And Rachel, lounging in her chair with one leg crossed over the other, looked like a cat that had already licked the cream. It wasn't just the audacity of the proposal, it was the history bleeding through every word. My parents had always favored Rachel. She was the golden child, a title she wore with careless ease, because she never had to work for it. At 16, she got a shiny new car with a bow on top, while I scraped together babysitting money to help pay for the used laptop I needed for school. When she declared she wanted to attend an out-of-state college with an eye-watering tuition bill, my parents wrote the checks without hesitation. Meanwhile, I applied for scholarships, took on part-time jobs, and lived off ramen to make it through my degree. And now, they wanted me to hand her a quarter of everything I had built. 25% of sleepless nights, 25% of the risk I carried on my shoulders, 25% of the years I sacrificed to dating, vacations, even my health to see patients when no one else would. All of it handed over to Rachel simply because she had been born with my parents' endless indulgence tucked neatly into her pocket. The anger rose quickly, sharp, and unrelenting. It pulsed through me, demanding release, but beneath the anger lay something colder: betrayal. My parents didn't see me as a woman who had clawed her way into success, as someone who had taken nothing and carved it into something living and breathing. No, they still saw me as a child they could control, a daughter whose work existed to be divided and redistributed like toys between siblings. I tightened my grip on my water glass to stop my hands from trembling. I wasn't trembling out of fear. I was trembling out of fury, a fury so strong it frightened even me. I wanted to stand, to shout, to demand how they dared to reduce me to a line item in a legal contract. But another part of me whispered that this had always been their way. They had never seen me as separate from Rachel, never understood that I was capable of standing on my own without their permission. Memories flashed unbidden, stoking the flames. I remembered the Christmas when I asked for a second-hand violin because I loved music, and Rachel asked for a designer handbag. She got the handbag. I got a sweater 2 sizes too big. I remembered the time I saved up for months to go on a school trip, only for my parents to cancel my place at the last minute, so they could use the money to buy Rachel a new phone. They called it fairness, a word that, in our household, had always meant sacrifice for me and reward for her. Now here we were, grown adults, and nothing had changed. Only the stakes were higher. This wasn't about cars or handbags or phones anymore. This was my livelihood, my identity, the place where people came for healing, and where I had poured every ounce of myself. And they had the gall to sit across from me in a restaurant, sipping wine, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to strip me of a quarter of it and hand it to Rachel. Rachel finally looked up from her phone, her painted nails tapping idly against the glass stem of her drink. "It's not a big deal, Emily," she said with a shrug. "You're doing great, and I'll help lighten your load. You should be grateful." Grateful. The word seared me. She spoke as though my work were a burden, as though her presence would be some kind of gift. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, but the laughter stuck like a stone in my throat. Lighten my load? Rachel didn't know the first thing about what I did. She had never scrubbed down an exam room, never pored over insurance paperwork until her eyes blurred, never stayed after hours to comfort a frightened patient. What she wanted wasn't to help me. What she wanted was profit, prestige, the shiny title of co-manager without any of the weight that came with it. And my parents, blind as ever, were ready to hand it to her because Rachel had always been the one they couldn't say no to. The betrayal twisted deeper. This wasn't just about Rachel taking what she hadn't earned. This was about my parents declaring, once again, that my sacrifices didn't matter. That no matter how much I achieved, no matter how fiercely I fought to stand on my own, they would never see me as enough without Rachel standing beside me, ready to collect her share. I met my father's eyes, the anger boiling so fiercely inside me that it sharpened my voice before I even spoke. But I didn't let the words escape. Not yet. I sat there, chest burning, anger coiled tight, forcing myself to stay still when every bone in my body screamed to fight. Because deep down, I knew this wasn't just another petty injustice. This was the line in the sand. They were trying to take from me something I had built with my own hands. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just angry. I was ready to make them see me for who I truly was. And that realization, more than anything else, fed the fire roaring in my chest. I tried to reason with them. "You can't just do this," I said, forcing the words past the tightness in my throat. "This is my clinic. I worked for it. Rachel had nothing to do with it." My mother's face rearranged itself in a way I knew too well, a polished stillness that meant the verdict had already been written. "Emily, don't be selfish. Family shares everything. Rachel deserves this. She's your sister." Deserves. The words slid like a blade under my ribs. My tongue went dry. For a second, I saw my reflection in the water glass, jaw clenched, eyes too bright. a grown woman trying not to look like a small, pleading child. Around us, the restaurant breathed and clattered along, oblivious. Waiters threading through aisles with practiced grace, ice chiming in highball glasses, a birthday candle flaring at the far wall while a table cheered. The ordinary world continued while mine constricted into a narrow corridor of humiliation. I swallowed. Sharing is when we both carry the weight, I said quietly. I carried all of it. My father didn't flinch. Don't turn this into drama. It's simple math and good sense. If Rachel manages, the clinic will be better positioned. Optics matter, Emily. Family businesses look stronger when the family is in it. He said the word optics as if he'd invented it, as if Image had ever signed a check or kept a light on at midnight. A tremor rippled up my arms and settled in my neck. Everything I wanted to say stacked up behind my teeth and jammed there. I wasn't shocked anymore. Shock had been a clean, icy hit. This was heavier, duller, more intimate. Pain moved in, pulled a chair up next to me, and folded its hands. They were doing what they had always done, only now the stakes were real. When I was 10 and Rachel was 12, my parents had used the same tone to explain why I should let her have the last slice of cake. She had had a harder week. When I was 14 and wanted to join a summer science program, my mother told me it was too far, too expensive, then drove Rachel 2 states away for a dance intensive because opportunities don't wait. When I was 19 and received a scholarship, my father teared up. Out of relief, he admitted later, because it meant they could finally replace the SUV Rachel had dented. Their gratitude always wore my name, but landed in Rachel's hands. Across the table, Rachel stared through me with that glossy patience she reserved for boutiques and blowouts. She had painted her nails the color of crushed cherries, and as she scrolled her phone with one finger, the polish caught the light like something edible, sweet, and impossible to refuse. It's not personal, she said, not looking up. You're overthinking. This is about efficiency. Efficiency. My mind flipped through images I wished I could stuff back into their files. The night the autoclave failed and I hand sanitized every instrument in a panic because the morning was fully booked. The first winter when the heating died and I brought space heaters from my apartment to keep the waiting room from freezing. The time I slept on the office floor between charts, the synthetic carpet imprinting a grid on my cheek when I woke. Efficiency had been a luxury I'd bought with exhaustion, one tiny upgrade at a time. I'd learned the weight of the word by lifting it alone. Family shares everything, my mother repeated, and that was when the floor of the past gave way completely. Every lesson swarmed back, pre-approved and laminated. Be the bigger person, Emily. Don't make a scene, Emily. Your sister needs this more, Emily. You can wait, Emily. You can always wait. I had learned to fold myself into smaller shapes to fit everyone else's comfort. The ache in my shoulders tonight was the bill for years of contortion. My fork lay on the plate at a careful angle, as if good behavior could still save me. The steak smelled like pepper and butter, fat singing on the surface, and I felt slightly nauseous at the richness of it, the careless abundance. My parents ordered dessert here without checking prices. My clinic had taught me the cost of everything: gauze by the case, gloves by the box, toner by the gallon, software subscriptions that dinged my account on the first of the month with the punctuality of a tax collector. I knew the exact dollar amount of confidence, how much faith cost when you had to buy it wholesale and store it in a broom closet until you had more shelves. Why now? I asked, surprised at how steady I sounded. Why this sudden interest? My father exhaled through his nose, the closest he came to a sigh. Because the timing is right. You've proven viability. It's wiser to expand under family leadership than to bring in outsiders who won't have your best interests at heart. His eyes flicked to the envelope, then to me. Don't be naive. Naive. I pinched the napkin under the table until the stitching bit into my fingers. The first year, when I signed a lease with a clause I didn't fully understand, I'd been naive. When I believed word of mouth would carry us without marketing, I'd been naive. When I thought my parents would celebrate me once success looked undeniable, I had been the most naive of all. My mother set down her glass, leaving a ring the shape of a small moon on the linen. Your patients will adore Rachel once they meet her, she said, as if adoration were a faucet you could just turn on. She's personable. She'll handle the front-facing work. You can stay in the back and focus on whatever you do in the back. Whatever I do in the back. I stared at my hands. Small scars crossed my knuckles from a year ago when a shelf bracket snapped and a tray came down, metal corners biting. Calluses formed where pens sat for too many hours, where latex tugged skin raw. Whatever I do in the back was 7,000 tiny decisions, 100 signed forms, 1,000 reassurances to people who arrived scared and left steadier. It was listening without looking at the clock. It was swallowing my own fear, so patients didn't have to taste it. The pain shifted shape. It wasn't just insult now. It had memory and texture. It sounded like Rachel's teenage contempt when I came home from a shift and collapsed on the sofa. You smell like a hospital. It looked like my father's attention sliding away while I explained a new scheduling system and landing instead on a sports ticker crawling silently across the TV. It felt like my mother's hug on the day I cut the ribbon. Light, careful, the kind of embrace you give a stranger at church. What if I say no? I asked, though we all understood that the question, as far as they were concerned, was a rhetorical flourish. My father's mouth twitched. That wouldn't be wise. You don't know what you don't know. He said it with the same cadence he used when I was 8 and asked why Rachel got the window seat. The power in his voice came from the assumption that he was the wall and I was the ball that would bounce off it. The waitress arrived to refill water. Her eyes met mine for a second, and I wondered what she saw. Another table about to leave a bad tip. A woman chewing on the rind of her own composure. A family portrait with the smiles peeled off. She retreated, and the silence settled again, thick as frosting. I could feel my pulse in my gums. I pressed my tongue to my molars like I used to do during math tests when I was trying not to cry. The urge to apologize bubbled up. Habit, muscle memory. Apologize for making things tense. Apologize for not being agreeable. Apologize for disappointing them by being something other than pliant. I swallowed it. It sat there, unsaid, a hot coal. My mother reached across and patted my wrist, the gesture almost tender, if not for the script beneath it. We're trying to help you, she said. You always act like we're against you, when all we want is to see you succeed. Help, another word with a price tag I could now read from across the room. Help meant rearranging my life, so their reflection in it was flattering. Help meant surrender wrapped in a bow. For a moment, a very small, dangerous moment, I considered giving in just to make the ache stop, to nod, to let the current take me, to pretend the loss was manageable because it would keep the peace. That's the quiet superstition they taught me. Peace at any cost is still peace. But even as the thought crossed, a sharper pain followed, like biting down and hitting metal, the knowledge that if I agreed, I would sign away not just profits, but the bone-deep truth of how I had made this life. I'd breathed in the smell of seared meat and bergamot from a passing plate, the cloying sweetness of someone's dessert, the faint bite of printer ink from the envelope my father guarded with his hand. My chest felt tight, but the tightness was honest. At least the body doesn't lie. All my life I had tried to earn their approval, not the noisy applause of parties and posts, but the quiet, simple recognition that I was real, that what I did mattered, because I did it. I believed if I succeeded, if I created something that could not be ignored, they would finally see me. Sitting there under the soft lamps, listening to them convert my work into a family asset, I understood the wound wasn't new. It was an old seam ripped open along the same line. They weren't twisting facts. They were twisting me, turning my achievement into an object lesson about loyalty, reminding me that in our house, merit was negotiable and love was a ledger. For a moment, I felt like the little girl again, the one pressed into the frame's edge while Rachel found the light, the one told to smile smaller so someone else could shine brighter, the one who learned to hold her breath because joy made noise. I sat very still, hands folded on the table, and let the pain be exactly what it was. Not a storm to outrun, not a test to ace, but a clear, unblinking mirror of what they believed about me. It hurt with a clean, specific honesty, and it left no room, at least not yet, for anything but the truth of that hurt. But this time was different. I wasn't a little girl anymore. I wasn't the child whose protests could be silenced by a sharp glance or a well-rehearsed lecture about loyalty. I wasn't the teenager who had to swallow disappointment because fairness was always defined as Rachel first. I was 25 years old, the founder and sole owner of a legally protected business. And while my parents had spent years convincing themselves that I was malleable, that I would bend the way I always had, they had underestimated me. The anger that had flared inside me a moment earlier cooled into something sharper, more deliberate. I felt the weight of the briefcase at my side, pressed against my leg under the table like a secret I had been saving for this very moment. My heart was pounding, but my hands were steady. I had learned early on that rage could be a wildfire, consuming everything in its path, or it could be refined into a blade. Tonight, I would wield the blade. I reached down, slow and measured, letting the leather creak as I unlatched the case. The sound alone seemed to shift the air. My parents didn't react at first. They weren't expecting resistance. They had spent so long assuming I would fold that they didn't notice when I straightened. Inside the briefcase were my clinic's foundational contracts, organized in folders I had memorized down to the tab color. I had reviewed them with my attorney 100 times, maybe more. At the time, I thought I was over-preparing, bordering on obsessive. But sitting here now, under the soft lighting of a restaurant where laughter and clinking glasses disguised the quiet battle being staged at our table, I realized preparation was the most powerful weapon I owned. My parents had no idea how thoroughly I had protected myself. They thought of me as diligent, yes, but not strategic. They thought my strength ended at hard work, that I was too busy with patience, too focused on the day-to-day grind, to think long-term. What they didn't understand was that my entire business had been born from one simple fear, that someone someday would try to take it from me. Every sleepless night, every cautious decision, every line I pored over with my lawyer was a shield I had built brick by brick. I opened the folder and slid a document back across the table, pushing it until it rested neatly in front of my father. He frowned, confused, as though I had handed him something irrelevant. His fingers smoothed the edge of the paper with the precision of a man trying to reassert control. My mother leaned closer, her lips tightening as if she could will the words into bending for her. Rachel finally looked up from her phone, annoyed at first, then curious. Clause 4.3. I said softly, my voice calm, almost gentle. Calmness unnerved them more than anger ever could. It states that no individual may assume managerial or financial rights without unanimous consent of existing ownership. I am the only owner. I let the pause stretch, watched their eyes scan the lines they couldn't change. Then I tapped their papers, the ones they had so smugly presented to me only minutes earlier. Which means this, I said, the word like a pin dropping in the quiet between us, is worthless. My father's brows furrowed deeper as he skimmed the clause, his lips pressing into a flat line. He was not a man who liked being caught off guard. His world was built on control, on believing he was always the most informed, the most capable, the one steering the conversation. But now he was reading the words of a contract he hadn't anticipated, words that boxed him in with legal precision. The silence stretched. For the first time all evening, I felt the balance shift. My mother's smile faltered, thin cracks forming at the edges. Rachel's face soured, a flicker of disbelief passing through her carefully painted expression. My father's hand twitched, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the page. The moment was more than just legal protection, it was reclamation. Every clause, every word, was a reminder that I had thought ahead, that I had built my clinic, not just with ambition, but with foresight. They had assumed I would come to the table defenseless, desperate for approval. Instead, I came armed with a very structure that made their schemes impossible. Inside, pain still coiled, but it no longer paralyzed me. The old ache of wanting their recognition was still there, but it no longer dictated my choices. I wasn't here to prove myself to them. I was here to defend what I had already proven to myself. As my father read the clause again, slower this time, I kept my eyes on him, steady and unblinking. I remembered the child version of me, watching him nod in approval at Rachel's smallest achievements, waiting for even a shred of that approval for myself. But now, I realized I didn't need it. The paper in his hand was proof that I had built something undeniable, something they couldn't twist or hand away. The restaurant carried on around us. Plates clattered, laughter erupted, glasses clinked. But at our table, silence ruled. I could almost hear the moment my parents recognized they had miscalculated. My father's confidence slipped, my mother's certainty cracked, and Rachel's entitlement evaporated into the space where their control had lived. The anger from before had transformed into something colder, steadier. Preparation wasn't just about contracts and clauses. It was about becoming the kind of woman who could sit across from the people who had underestimated her all her life and calmly dismantle their assumptions with a single line of text. Clause 4.3 wasn't just a rule. It was my shield, my declaration, my refusal to be bent back into the shape of the obedient daughter. And in that moment, watching my father's frown deepen, I knew they hadn't just underestimated my business sense. They had underestimated me. My father's face flushed deep crimson, the color creeping up his neck until it settled at his temples. His jaw locked so tightly I could hear the faint grind of his teeth. A sound I remembered from childhood, the same sound he made when a referee called a foul he didn't agree with, or when a neighbor dared to park in front of our house. He prided himself on being the smartest man in the room, the one who anticipated every angle, the one whose voice carried the final authority. But now, with a single clause and a single word, I had cornered him, and he hated it. My mother's composure cracked in a more subtle way. Her smile, always carefully controlled like a mask polished for company, faltered at the edges. She shifted in her chair, her fingers tightening around the stem of her wine glass until the knuckles whitened. For years, she had played the role of mediator, smoothing over my father's sharpness with soft words and practiced smiles. But this time, she had no script to rely on. My calmness had dismantled theirs. Rachel, meanwhile, shifted uncomfortably, for once unable to hide her agitation. Her phone, which had been glued to her palm all evening, now sat face down on the table. She crossed and uncrossed her legs, her eyes darting between me and our father, as if searching for some invisible lifeline that wasn't there. Her entitlement had been so deeply ingrained that she never doubted she would get her way. For the first time, she realized her inheritance of privilege had a limit. Me. You're making a mistake, my father snapped finally, his voice breaking the thick silence that had settled between us. His words cut through the restaurant's background noise, sharper than the clink of cutlery or the murmur of distant conversations. He leaned forward, his finger pressing hard into the stack of documents as if force could make them legitimate. Family should come first. The phrase was meant to wound, to shame me into obedience. It was a weapon honed over decades of repetition, one I had heard in 100 variations. Family shares everything, Emily. Don't be selfish, Emily. Your sister needs this more than you do, Emily. Each repetition had been designed to shape me into compliance. But tonight, the old blade had lost its edge. I met his eyes without flinching. My voice came out steady, carrying a weight I hadn't felt before. No, I said, letting the word linger in the air. Respect comes first, and you've shown me none. The silence that followed was almost physical. It pressed down on us, thick and heavy, as though the entire restaurant had paused to witness the fracture in our family dynamic. My father recoiled slightly, not in fear, but in disbelief. In his world, respect was something demanded, not reciprocated. My refusal to bow to his authority wasn't just defiance, it was a declaration that the old order no longer applied. My mother opened her mouth as if to interject, but the words caught. She looked at me with something between anger and recognition, as though part of her wanted to scold me and part of her knew the truth of what I had said. She had lived too long in my father's shadow to fight openly, but her silence betrayed her. Rachel let out a small, incredulous laugh, though it carried no humor. You're seriously doing this, she said, her voice brittle. Over money? Over something that wouldn't even hurt you to share. Her words landed exactly as she intended, not as a question, but as an accusation. To her, my refusal was cruelty, but I didn't let it sink in. I thought of the nights I had driven home so tired my vision blurred, of the mornings I opened the clinic alone, the first to arrive and the last to leave. 25% wasn't just numbers on a page. It was years of sacrifice, years of myself. This isn't about money, I said firmly, turning to her. It's about principle. You can't take what you didn't earn and call it sharing. The steel in my voice left Rachel silent. She slouched back, lips pressed into a thin line, her usual arsenal of comebacks evaporating in the face of something she had never seen from me before. Resolve. For once, my parents had no quick retort, no lecture about loyalty, no parable about the strength of family unity, no manipulative twist to corner me. The table that had so often been their stage was now my ground. I had drawn the line, and they had run straight into it. My father's breathing grew heavier, each exhale flaring his nostrils. He tapped the paper once more, then shoved it back across the table as though its presence offended him. My mother shifted her gaze downward, staring at the condensation ring her glass had left on the linen, her mask fully broken. Rachel fiddled with her bracelet, spinning it around her wrist like a nervous child. I leaned back, not smug, not triumphant, but steady. My heart was racing, but my hands were calm in my lap. The strength I felt wasn't loud. It wasn't the roar of victory or the thrill of revenge. It was something quieter, something deeper. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for their approval, their recognition, or even their acceptance. I didn't need it. The confrontation wasn't about whether they would yield. It was about whether I would stand. And I had. The silence stretched on, a silence that told me they finally understood. I wasn't their child to control anymore. I was the woman who had built something untouchable, and no amount of pressure, guilt, or manipulation could strip it from me. And in that silence, I realized something even more powerful. I had already won. Dinner dissolved into an uneasy quiet, the kind that doesn't come from peace, but from words left unspoken, sharp and jagged in the throat. The plates of half-eaten food sat cooling on the table, the smell of butter and charred meat fading into something stale. My parents' conversation sputtered into mutters about my ingratitude, their voices low, but deliberate enough to sting. They left their wine glasses still half full, the Chardonnay untouched, the Cabernet breathing into nothing. Rachel pushed back her chair with enough force to scrape the floor, her eyes blazing with a fury, born not of true loss, but of entitlement denied. She stormed out, heels striking the tile with clipped, angry rhythm, her exit dramatic enough to draw glances from nearby tables. But I didn't chase after them. I didn't shrink in embarrassment under the weight of curious eyes. I walked out of that restaurant with my head high, the cool night air greeting me like a reward. The tension that had hung around my neck like a collar loosened with every step. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a daughter defending herself against impossible standards or a sister begging for equal ground. I felt like a woman who had stood firm, who had carved out her place with her own hands, and had refused to let anyone take it. This victory wasn't about contracts or clauses, though they had been my weapon. It was about reclaiming my voice from people who had spent years talking over it. My family's attempt to seize control wasn't just an attack on the clinic. It was an attack on me, on the years of sacrifice I had invested, on the nights I had gone without sleep, the mornings I had shown up despite exhaustion, the dreams I had dared to believe were mine alone. By holding my ground, I wasn't just protecting a business. I was defending the very core of who I had become. The walk to my car felt different than any walk I had taken before. My heels clicked on the pavement with a rhythm that wasn't hurried, wasn't anxious. The sound was steady, deliberate, almost ceremonial. The air was sharp with the scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen, and I breathed it in deeply, letting the coolness burn through my lungs. My reflection in the car window caught me off guard, not because I looked any different, but because I finally recognized myself. The lines of determination on my face weren't harsh. They were earned. The next morning, I woke before my alarm, not out of dread, but out of a renewed energy I hadn't felt in months. Sunlight spilled through the blinds in pale, golden bands, and instead of feeling weighed down by responsibility, I felt anchored by purpose. When I arrived at the clinic, the building greeted me like a home that had been waiting, sturdy and alive. The glass doors reflected the morning sky, pale blue streaked with faint clouds, and the brass handle was cool under my touch as I pulled it open. Inside, life moved as it always had, steady, reliable, full of small, ordinary miracles. Patients were already waiting in the lobby, flipping through magazines or tapping quietly on their phones. The receptionist smiled when she saw me, handing out intake forms with practiced ease. Nurses in scrubs moved briskly, preparing rooms, checking supplies, their hands efficient, their voices calm. The hum of the printer, the squeak of shoes on the polished floor, the soft murmur of conversation, all of it blended into a rhythm that was uniquely ours. This place was mine, not in the sense of ownership written on paper, but in the deeper sense of identity. Every detail bore my mark. The chairs I had chosen for comfort, the calming color of the walls, the framed art that reminded patients of warmth instead of sterility. Even the faint scent of antiseptic carried pride rather than shame. It was proof that from nothing, I had built something lasting. I paused by the window at the end of the hall, looking out over the small parking lot where patients came and went. Their cars shifted in and out of spaces, each one a life intersecting with the work I had dedicated myself to. That was the true measure of success, not the approval of my parents, not the envy of my sister, but the quiet trust of the people who walked through these doors every day seeking help and finding it. For years, I had told myself that triumph would look like a headline, an award, a plaque with my name engraved in gold. But standing there in my clinic, watching the day unfold with its steady rhythm, I realized triumph was quieter. It was resilience embodied in the steady continuation of life. It was the fact that my family's schemes hadn't disrupted a single appointment, hadn't stopped a single chart from being filed, hadn't shaken a single patient's faith. Their storm had broken against the walls I had built, and the clinic stood unshaken. When I stepped into my office, the desk was cluttered with notes, charts, and reminders, the familiar chaos of responsibility. Yet it felt different now, not overwhelming, but affirming. Every sticky note, every half-filled calendar square, every stack of paperwork was a reminder of the work I had chosen, not the work imposed on me. And more than that, it was a reminder that this life was mine, solid and unshakable. Triumph wasn't loud that morning. It didn't demand attention. It existed in the steadiness of my breath, in the quiet strength of my steps, in the calm certainty that I had faced down the people who believed they could still control me, and I had won. And as the clinic buzzed around me, as patients smiled and staff worked with quiet dedication, I understood the real victory wasn't just in keeping the clinic. It was in finally realizing I didn't need anyone's permission to claim it as mine. That night, I sat alone in my office with the door half closed and the lights turned low, letting the soft hum of the HVAC settle my thoughts. The monitor's sleep light pulsed like a slow heartbeat. Alcohol wipes, neatly stacked, cast square shadows on the counter. The calendar on the wall showed a month dense with ink. Names, follow-ups, small arrows where I'd made space for people who couldn't wait. Every object in that room had a story that pointed back to one stubborn fact. I built this. I let my eyes move across the space, taking inventory the way I do before a long day. The reception chairs with their rounded arms, the ones I tested for hours, so older patients wouldn't wince when sitting. The paint color I mixed twice, because the first shade felt like a hospital and not a place where fear should loosen its grip. The small bookshelf with dog-eared paperbacks donated by a patient who said reading a chapter distracted her from her blood pressure cuff. The steel cart whose wheel I replaced at midnight with a micro-socket set because it squealed at every turn. the tiny scuffs on the baseboards from winter boots, proof that people arrived even when snow made the city honest. Even the faint scent of isopropyl and citrus cleaner felt like a signature. Mine. I thought about the smiles that had passed through this room, after stitches came out clean, after pain subsided, after someone learned that their numbers were better than last time. Those smiles were modest victories, the kind that never make a headline, but reset a life by a few degrees. They existed because I refused to give up when the waiting room was empty, when the bank account threatened to blink red, when a new policy meant the software had to be relearned at 2 a.m. I wasn't dramatic about it then. I'm not romantic about it now. Persistence is less a feeling than a posture. For years, though, my spine bent toward my parents' approval like a plant leaning for light that never arrived. I had believed their praise was currency, that without it the market would reject me. I kept books in my head where every achievement was logged as a credit and every shrug from them erased a line. Tonight the ledger went quiet. My worth had never been theirs to give, and it never belonged on their balance sheet. What finally made that truth usable wasn't the heat of anger. It was the precision of boundaries. People think boundaries are fences you throw up in a panic. In medicine, boundaries are infrastructure. We chart so care has continuity. We dose so treatment helps and doesn't harm. We sterilize so healing isn't undone by negligence. Boundaries are how respect takes shape in the world. I had drawn a boundary into my business the way we draw sterile fields onto skin. Clear, non-negotiable, protective. Clause 4.3 wasn't a trick. It was consent in writing. No ownership change without the owner's yes. No extraction disguised as family. Justice doesn't always roar. I used to think it did. That fairness arrived like thunder. That you feel it through your ribs. Tonight, I understood justice can move like paper under a palm. Like ink on a line that refuses to bend. It can be a single quiet moment in a restaurant where you slide a clause across the table and watch the people who underestimated you fall still because the ground they counted on isn't there. The silence afterward wasn't empty. It was calibrated. I looked at my keys on the desk, 6 of them, different teeth. Front door, back door, meds cabinet, records room, supply closet, office. For years, I'd carried them like a weight, the physical proof of responsibility. Tonight they felt like a vocabulary. Keys are a way of saying, I decide who enters. I decide what remains secured. For so long, I tried to hand that decision to my parents without admitting it. Little permissions, small surrenders of schedule and space. I thought obligation and love were the same metal. They're not. Obligation corrodes. Love is stainless when paired with respect. Respect comes first. Saying it earlier had felt like tossing a stone into deep water and waiting to hear a splash. Sitting here, I heard it echo back from the life I'd constructed. The processes that ran on time because I made them. The people whose trust continued because I earned it. Respect wasn't a banner I expected my parents to hold. It was the architecture I live inside. And architecture doesn't beg to be seen. It stands. I let the earlier scenes replay in short cuts. The envelope, the clause, my father's tightened jaw, my own voice steady on the words. Not to savor them, but to file them properly. Pain goes in one folder, anger in another, relief in a third. Inspiration needed its own tab, because what rose in me now wasn't triumph over them. It was clarity about me. I had mistaken compliance for love so many times that rebellion felt like betrayal. Tonight, restraint felt like courage. Holding my line wasn't loud, but it was exact. I thought of the staff working the morning shift, of their quiet competence. They don't come from my family history or my narratives about childhood fairness. They come because this place functions. The best apology to my younger self isn't a speech. It's systems that protect her labor. It's the payroll going out on time, the supplies ordered before panic, the grief we carry for people we couldn't help being matched by the gratitude for those we did. Boundaries make that steadiness possible. Boundaries keep the room clean for healing. A breeze slipped through the vent and stirred the corner of a sticky note where I'd written a single word weeks ago: steadfast. I'd put it there to counter my occasional unrest, the days when certainty frayed. I smiled, not at the word, but at the person who needed it, and wrote it anyway. Self-trust grows weirdly, by acts repeated until doubt runs out of breath. My victory tonight wasn't merely that the clinic remained mine. Ownership papers are a necessary floor, not a ceiling. The real win was the correction of a long error. Boundaries aren't selfish. They are the ethical form of love. For the work, for the people it serves, and finally, for myself. Saying no to extraction makes room for yes to purpose. Saying no to manipulation makes room for yes to competence. Saying no to old scripts makes room for a voice that doesn't tremble. The clock in the hall clicked to the next minute. I didn't feel grand. I felt aligned. There's a difference. Grandness wants witnesses. Alignment only requires truth. The truth was simple. I didn't feel like a daughter begging to be seen. I felt like a woman whose hands matched her life, whose plans matched her practice, who had built something no one could take because it wasn't given. It was made. I stood, not to leave, not to announce anything to an empty room, but to feel the weight of my feet on the floor I paid for, the floor I mop when the service misses a spot, the floor that scuffs and shines and holds. The building answered the way buildings do, with quiet. Not silence like absence, but silence like consent. Tomorrow would bring its own arithmetic. It always does. Tonight, I let the breath go out, slow and even, and let the office hold me steady. Inspiration didn't flare. It settled. Low, warm, constant. The kind you can work by. The kind that lasts.